Hey everyone, I'm Stephen Smith, and I'll be doing the sculpture portion of Intro to Studio Art. What I want to do before we jump into it is give you a little background on sculpture and design thinking. Up until now, we've been focusing on creating two-dimensional art and trying to portray it as a three-dimensional object by giving it value, shadow, light, texture, all these different things. So now we're actually going to do the opposite. We're going to actually start the 2D object. We're going to make a 3D object out of it, right? Instead of looking at a 3D object and making a 2D representation of it. And so before we get there, I want to give you, again, just a little history, but also some foundation that I think will help you with some vocabulary, with some explanation of some really important concepts that I think will almost be a guide for you as you're doing this next portion of the project. And the sculpture project will be broken up until about 3 or 4 parts, and each one will kind of build on the next one. So with that, I will go through spatial relationships, and you'll be able to find this on Blackboard. Okay, so first we will start with the principles of design, and specifically the verbs of the design language. And I think it's helpful to think about the design language as being an action, right? Design as being an action. And so that's why we're going back to verbs, we're going back to language to help us define some of these ideas. So like I was saying before, a common problem that we're thinking of is space, okay? So up until now, we've been representing space on a 2D blank page. And so now we're going to take that and we're going to make it something that's three-dimensional. So if we think about space, it's broken up by positive and negative shapes, as we're seeing on this image here. We have a positive shape, which is our black square. And we have a negative shape, which is the white space around it. And it's important to understand both of those things. For instance, when we have this one positive shape, it's giving us a focal point, right? It's like if we have a chair in an empty room, that is automatically bringing our attention. If we bring in a second element, now we have a relationship between the two. And that's where we start to really break down some of these principles of design and composition. First thing to think about in any composition is balance and understanding how humans see things. We see things bilaterally. So I'm going to see this implied axis even when we're looking at this page. So oftentimes this is why it's natural for people to have a symmetrical geometry, right? It's a very formal geometry as we're seeing here, in which it's identical imagery that's been mirrored on the center. As opposed to that, we have asymmetry, right? Or something that's more of an informal balance system. And this would probably be something, or a balance system that you may have been using on your abstract art composition. This is a case where we have still have visual weight, right? Where here the visual weight is equal. Here it is still relatively equal in this composition, but it's not identical. And by understanding visual weight, we're just looking at the size and shape of these different elements on the page. And if it feels like it's balanced. Here's another case where we have approximate symmetry. Again, where the weight feels balanced, even though this is not an identically mirrored object. We have radial symmetry. Again, this is still symmetrical on that center point, except we have all of these different rectangles that are radiating and rotating around the center. And all these things together can give us unity, right? All of these elements being in harmony with one another is the focal point. That's bringing together the whole design. And so I'm thinking about three important principles in order to create unity. We have repetition, variety, and rhythm. So here's an example looking at repetition. We have a repeated rectangular object, repeated multiple times. Now if we change this, right, if we repeat but add variety, we don't want to change too much, right, because then it might be more confusing. We want it to be changing the character, maybe the size, the shape, the scale, but still allow it to be balanced. All these things together, right, repetition and variety, would give us rhythm, right? We have a nice rhythm in this composition. And then we can have a complex rhythm as opposed to this balanced rhythm. It's much more dynamic, still has a good balance to it, but we're also adding different values, in this case, different colors, scales, tones. And then on the flip side, we can create an emphasis by creating one thing or by creating contrasting shapes or forms. Here's another example of contrasting shapes and forms. And we can also think about something that's different, right? An anomaly, something that's out of place. This is showing us contrast. So just wrapping up all these things, thinking about design as balance, unity through repetition, variety, rhythm, creating an emphasis or contrast, and then always keeping in mind scale and proportion in what we do. All right, so moving forward now, taking that and applying it to spatial relationships. Okay, so we'll think about this in a couple terms. I'm also going to bring in spatial relationships in sculpture and architecture as some visual examples. Here's an example of weaving and another one of weaving. We think about shifting horizontally or vertically, or stacking. These are all spatial verbs that convey movement, right? Intersecting, folding, rotating, right? All of these action verbs give you a sense of movement. Curving, something that's faceted, triangulated, aggregated, something that's repeated, linked, something that's carved through addition or subtraction, composition of different forms, a blurring of a grid, and this is an inhabitable structure that we're looking at here, right? This is a pavilion that is also a sculpture. And now if we're thinking about this in some historical examples of art, we think about color and repetition, Joseph Oliver's Homage to the Square, in understanding the different scales, color relationships, by using the same repeated shapes and elements over and over, but by changing subtle things. Think about transparency and materiality in a similar way that we were just using transparency as watercolor. Think about interlocking geometry like M.C. Escher's tessellations. Here's Brancusi's endless column, which is just a simple repeated stacked element. It gives you this sense that it just continues on. Think about using light using an implied grid. Even if the grid is not there, we have a very strict grid on the left. We have an implied grid on the right. Both of them have a grid. One of them is significantly more noticeable than the other, but they're both there. Ideas of compression, compression of space, ones that also expand and open up, or tension, something that feels like it's being pulled, stacked, repeated elements like Donald Judd's, different sculptures here. And then also thinking about folding. How can we repeat these elements? This is going to translate into our project. Thinking about how we can use simple geometry, repeat it through cutting, through addition, through subtraction, possibly through the use of color, how we can create a low relief sculpture, like the ones we're seeing here, that takes something that starts off as two-dimensional and makes it a three-dimensional composition. Okay. So again, you'll be able to find that presentation and a link on Blackboard. And I encourage you to go back and review it again as you're going through, or even if you get stumped, right? If you get design block and you're just trying to think of some ideas to come up with. The idea is to, again, try to think of some of those spatial verbs. Think about those action verbs. How can you create art? How can you create a sculpture that has these different things? That has rhythm, that has movement, that has balance, unity, repetition. Okay, so we'll now explain the next portion of the project, and I'll show you what you need to get started.